Hi, this is Professor Favors with American Literature. So the topic lecture today is W.E.B. Du Bois's Selections from the Souls of Black Folk. The actual text is actually The Souls of Black Folk, and it is a larger work, but we are only getting selections from the main text. This is also part of turn of the 20th century in terms of the literary work, which also contributes to the growth of modernism. So this is American Literature, W.E.B. Du Bois's Selections from the Souls of Black Folk. This presentation is subject to fair use. So here's Du Bois, born 1868, died 1963. William Edward Burghardt Du Bois was born in Massachusetts to an affluent family in Great Barrington, a town with few African American families. Du Bois describes his youth as pleasant until, while in school, he realized that his skin color, not his academic ability, set him apart from his peers. While growing up in Massachusetts, Du Bois self-identified as mulatto before moving to Nashville to attend Fisk University, where he first began to encounter Jim Crow laws. After finishing his bachelor's degree at Fisk University, Du Bois began graduate study at Harvard University. In 1895, Du Bois completed his PhD, becoming the first African American to earn a PhD from Harvard University. While at Harvard, Du Bois was an academic standout. Indeed, Harvard University Press later published his dissertation as the first volume in their Harvard Historical Studies series. After completing his PhD, Du Bois went on to hold multiple teaching appointments, first at Wilberforce College, then at the University of Pennsylvania, before moving to Atlanta University, where he produced his classic work, Souls of Black Folk. In 1910, Du Bois left the academy to move to New York City, where he co-founded the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. In his writings, Du Bois was openly critical of Washington, whom he saw as an accommodationist. Du Bois he disagreed with many of Washington's views and was especially angered by the result of Plessy v. Ferguson. By 1920, Du Bois grew frustrated with what he viewed as a lack of positive movement on racial progress. He spent the second half of his career focusing on legislative reform for national race relations, as well as turning his attention to the socio-economic conditions of African Americans in the U.S. Later in life, a disillusioned Du Bois renounced his American citizenship, joined the Communist Party, and moved to Ghana in 1961, where he remained until his death in 1963. So that's Du Bois. About selections from the Souls of Black Folk, there's a bit of a issue with the date. The date of composition is really 1903, but I did see in the previous slide 1905. But it is actually 1903. Throughout his life, Du Bois remained one of the most influential academics of his time. However, he is best known for his book, Souls of Black Folks, which is a compilation of 14 essays. In Of Our Spiritual Strivings, Du Bois introduces the idea of double consciousness, possibly his most famous literary academic contribution. Du Bois describes double consciousness as the sense of always looking at one's self through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. One ever feels his two-ness and American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts. And so we go over that as well throughout the presentation. So let's remind ourselves about the historical implications because the main author references the or has an anger towards the Plessy v. Ferguson case, we still have to bring it forward even into this presentation. So the date range is 1816 to 1954 because 1954 ends segregation, making it illegal. So 1816, American Colonization Society proposed to free slaves and send them back to Africa. That begins sort of like your pre-abolitionist movement. 1819, that's our first peacetime financial crisis in the U.S. It's the same time that Thomas Jefferson founds the University of Virginia. We have two territories becoming states, Maine and Missouri, Florida becoming a U.S. territory. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 allowed to become a slave state. And so then we have 1826, Thomas Jefferson and John Adams dying on the same day. Now we have this new information from the previous lecture about Jim Crow and how it is created in 1828. Jim Crow is an actual character that Thomas Dartmouth writes, a white actor performing in blackface. He creates Jim Crow. And then Andrew Jackson becomes president in 1829. We have anti-slavery sentiment beginning, which now begins the abolitionist movement. Nat Turner's revolt, slavery debates, Oberlin College enrolling female students, Florida, Texas becoming states, Mexican-American War begins. Then we have the Fugitive Slave Act, because remember, this is 1850, so we still don't have the Emancipation Proclamation in place yet, right? Nor do we have the American Civil War. So slaves that run away could be taken back or arrested and taken back to their owners. Dred Scott decision, where slaves and black descendants from slaves were not American or were not considered American citizens and could not sue. So then we have multiple amendments based off the activities of the American Civil War, which is 1861 to 1865, Emancipation Proclamation, 1863, and from 1863 to 1877, we have the Reconstruction era. So that's basically the U.S. or the Union allowing the 11 succeeded Confederate states back into the Union, that process. Of course, we have the assassination of President Lincoln, the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery, the 14th Amendment granting citizenship and equal protection under the law, the 15th Amendment granting black men the right to vote, exactly no racial discrimination in voting. That didn't mean that black women could vote. And then 1870 abolitionist movement technically ends here. So then we have industrial revolution, technology improvements, economic growth. And just when we are about to grow, just when we're about to move forward, we have Jim Crow laws starting. So even if the 11 succeeded states are admitted back into the Union, they are admitted back into the Union with some form of vengeance in their heart. And that's just been a little bias, of course, but that has to be true if Jim Crow laws are now enforcing racial segregation, because the technological improvements, rapid economic growth, industrialization should bring us actually all together. So then 1890, the Women's Suffrage Association forms. 1890 also is during the time of the Separate Car Act, equal but separate accommodations doctrine. This brings about the Plessy v. Ferguson case, where they assess the separate but equal doctrine to determine the constitutionality of racial segregation, reviewed meaning behind 14th Amendment. So then even if sometimes the literary work doesn't always reference a particular war, Du Bois's work does. So because he does reference that war, we need to consider it. 1898, Spanish-American War. And then the 19th Amendment is the women's right to vote, but this was for white women who got the right to vote, not black women. Black women did not get the right to vote, as we'll see, as you'll see in your writing strategy, when it came to the Voting Rights Act of 1965, I think. So that's 45 years later. And then, of course, Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka basically ruled that separate but equal doctrine is unconstitutional. And so that officially ends the um, Jim Crow laws. So we need to still review certain post-Civil War laws, especially emancipation and then application to succeeded states, because both of your works, your W.E.B. Du Bois's work as well as the Booker T. Washington work, reference the Emancipation Proclamation. So let's recap. So again, the American Civil War between Union and Confederacy states, Emancipation Proclamation, all persons held as slaves within the rebellious states are free. 1863 to 1877, that's your Reconstruction era. Assassination of President Lincoln, 13th Amendment abolishing slavery, 14th Amendment granting citizenship, 15th Amendment gave black men the right to vote, abolitionist movement technically ends, and now beginning Jim Crow laws. So let's review some case law, the Plessy v. Ferguson case, 1896, and the Separate Car Act, 1890. So for Plessy v. Ferguson, which was your origination date 1892, it challenged the Separate Car Act of 1890, and the decision date was 1896 May. So the purpose was to assess the constitutionality of racial segregation, referring to the doctrine separate but equal, and the key laws that the plaintiffs made focused on the 13th Amendment and the 14th Amendment, and so it required, the Separate Car Act required that railroads operating in the state provide equal but separate accommodations for white and African American passengers. African American was not a term actually used during that time. Prohibited passengers from entering accommodations on the basis of race. Law does not apply to interstate travel. So any travel within the state, intrastate, this Separate Car Act was enacted. So the test case was the Citizens Committee to test the constitutionality of the Separate Car Law, which was in 1891. So the way that the test case went was to use an individual who sort of was racially ambiguous in terms of being biracial. So a group of Creole professionals in New Orleans formed the Citizens Committee to test the constitutionality of the Separate Car Law, hiring Albion Torgy, a Reconstruction era judge and social reformer, as legal counsel. The committee chose a person of mixed race, Homer Plessy, 7/8 white, 1/8 African American, to argue that the law could not be consistently applied due to the failure to define white and colored races. Plessy purchased a rail ticket for travel in Louisiana, so that's interstate, took a seat in a car designated for white passengers, refused to move to a car for African American passengers, was arrested and charged with violating the Separate Car Act, and argued that the act was unconstitutional, citing the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery. U.S. District Court Judge John H. Ferguson dismissed Plessy's argument. Louisiana State Supreme Court affirmed the district court's ruling. The U.S. Supreme Court granted Plessy the right to oral arguments, and the court rendered a decision. So there were two types of decisions. There was a majority decision opinion, and then a dissenting opinion based upon that decision that separate but equal was not unconstitutional. So first opinion by Justice Henry Billings Brown. Judge Brown rejected Plessy's argument that the act violated the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which prohibited slavery. Opinion 2, he rejected Plessy's argument that the act violated the 14th Amendment, which grants equal rights and citizenship. The 13th Amendment did not conflict with the Separate Car Act because the Separate Car Act does not reestablish slavery or a badge of slavery. Judge cited Supreme Court rulings in civil rights cases, which outlined that racial discrimination against African Americans in inns, public conveyances, places of amusement, does not impose a badge of slavery or involuntary servitude. It infringes rights protected from state aggression. And then the last opinion, the 14th Amendment, does not conflict with the Separate Car Law because the 14th Amendment secures legal equality, not necessarily social equality for African Americans and whites. The accommodations were equal, and racial segregation did not imply legal inferiority. So that suggests then that it implies social um, inferiority. The Separate Car Act preserves public peace and good order. So here is a dissenting opinion from Justice John Marshall Harlan, and he says the court ignored the obvious purpose of the Separate Car Act, which was to exclude colored people from coaches occupied by or assigned to white persons, and not exclude white persons from railroad cars occupied by blacks. So blacks can't go where whites are sitting, but whites can go where blacks are sitting. It is important to compel colored persons to keep to themselves while traveling in railroad passenger coaches. The statute interferes with the personal freedom. So here's where he's outlining what the initial presuppositions were, what the arguments were, but he's also adding a criticism, um, which reflects his dissenting opinion that the statute, the Separate Car Act, really does interfere with the personal freedom of citizens, particularly the personal liberty and freedom of movement of both African Americans and whites on the arbitrary basis of race. The, the Constitution actually should be colorblind, and all citizens should be equal under the law. The judgment this day rendered will in time prove to be quite as pernicious as the decisions made by this tribunal in the Dred Scott case, which declared that African Americans were not entitled to rights of citizenship. So let's review Jim Crow laws again, segregation of whites and persons of color. And this is Thomas Dartmouth Rice. Remember, he's the one white man performing in blackface, and he created the Jim Crow character. So Jim Crow laws, 1877 till about 1950, which is really 1954. Jim Crow laws enforced racial segregation in the South between the end of Reconstruction and the beginning of the Civil Rights Movement. Jim Crow was the name of a minstrel routine performed in the beginning in 1828 by Thomas Dartmouth Rice to imitate African Americans in segregated life. Jim Crow law origins. So prior to the American Civil War, because slaves were perceived as inferior in status, there wasn't a need to establish laws segregating them from white people. Provided slaves recognized their subordinate place, both races could work side by side. So in other words, they missed an opportunity to make the situation between blacks and whites and former slaves, actually legal, because they relied on their idea that blacks are inferior in status. So there's really no need to create a law. Although some form of segregation existed before 1860, there was no uniform pattern to segregation. Some southern states were not unified in how they would apply segregation because there was no public education prior to the war. So some states were fully integrated. North Carolina saw former slaves and whites sit next to each other in jury pools. Texas required every train to have one car for people of color. In 1877, the Supreme Court ruled in Hall v. Decuir that states could not prohibit segregation on common carriers, such as railroads, streetcars, riverboats. The Civil Rights Acts of 1883 overturned key elements of the Civil Rights Act of 1875, sanctioning the notion separate but equal without using the term. So they're still, even though they missed the opportunity to make it a legal thing in terms of segregation, it's almost like they're trying to play a catch-up game because Reconstruction era ended in 1877. So that means they no longer they know they no longer have the sort of power that they thought they had. Even though some states, Emancipation Proclamation 1865, 1863. So you had still many people free, but there were still some southern states trying to participate um, in plantation living. So here is a solution to the problem of race relations. Louisville and New Orleans and Texas Railway v. Mississippi required segregation on intrastate carriers. 1887 to 1892, 9 states passed laws requiring separation on streetcars and railroads, required equal accommodation for black passengers, imposed fines, jail terms for railroad employees, and then 5 states provided criminal fines or imprisonment for passengers sitting cars where their race was not was excluded. So the solution to the problem of race relations, blacks and whites mixing, was the Louisiana Separate Car Act. Promote the comfort of passengers, provide equal but separate accommodations for the white and colored races. The law marked a humiliating reversal of fortune, however, for black and mixed race citizens who enjoyed a more tolerant attitude and autonomy from the slave state toward people of color, Creoles in particular, who were part of a third class, free descendants of European fathers and African mothers who could marry, testify in court against whites, and inherit property. So it stripped them, the Separate Car Act stripped them of their conveniences. Southern state legislators passed Jim Crow laws as well. So, and they passed it based upon this idea: anyone ascertainable or strongly suspected of black ancestry in any degree, that person is considered a people of color or person of color. So there's separation of whites from persons of color on public transportation, schools, parks, cemeteries, theaters, restaurants, and the goal was to prevent contact between blacks and whites. Jim Crow laws were codified by the decision of the U.S. Supreme Court, Plessy v. Ferguson, that separate but equal doctrine is not unconstitutional. So that means it is constitutional. So here was the response to Jim Crow laws, which allow people to challenge the Separate Car Act. The Citizens Committee to test the constitutionality of the Separate Car Act questions. So they based their challenge to the law on 2 questions. How did the law or a train conductor determine the race of a passenger? The determination of race was a complex question of both science and law. This issue could not be delegated to a train official. So then the case Louisiana X Rail Abbott v. Hicks, a train conductor on the Texas and Pacific Railway was prosecuted for seating a black passenger in a white car that was traveling between 2 states, so that's now interstate. The case argued that the Louisiana law did not apply to interstate travel, or if it did, it was unconstitutional under the Commerce Clause. Louisiana court agreed that regulations under the Separate Car Act did not apply to interstate passengers. The committee and Homer Plessy, a light-skinned shoemaker, used the committee used Homer Plessy, a light-skinned shoemaker, to test the law. So here was the actual test event, and we're still challenging the Jim Crow laws. So on June 7, 1892, Homer Plessy purchased a first-class ticket to Covington in the Press Street Depot in New Orleans. He boarded the East Louisiana Railroad's number 8 train. The train conductor asked him if he was a colored man. Plessy said yes. The train conductor tried to get him to move to the colored car. Plessy refused by saying, "I am an American citizen. I have paid for a first-class ticket and intend to ride to Covington in the first-class car." The train conductor stopped the train and had him arrested and forcibly dragged by a detective with the help of other passengers. Plessy spent a night in jail, answered charges. He was accused of violating the Separate Car Act. Plessy failed in court, and the Supreme Court solidified the establishment of Jim Crow era. So the fact that they ruled against him sustained the law. So let's recap Jim Crow laws again in terms of timeline. Thomas Dartmouth writes, creates the Jim Crow character. The 13th Amendment abolishes slavery. A case rules that states cannot prohibit segregation. The Supreme Court declares the Civil Rights Act unconstitutional, sanctioning separate but equal. Louisiana State Car Act requires equal but separate accommodations. Supreme Court upholds the Separate Car Act in Plessy v. Ferguson, solidifying the Jim Crow era. Jim Crow laws expand to segregation in different areas, all ways of life. Supreme Court rules in Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka, 1954, that separate but equal is unconstitutional. And then 1964 came with it different laws as well. So the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. This is where black women got the right to vote now. The Fair Housing Act of 1968, and then we had interracial marriages, Loving v. Virginia, 1964, and this called miscegenation laws are considered unconstitutional. These advances in the Jim Crow era. So let's recap historical and literary periods today. So that's your American Civil War, Spanish American War, and then those literary periods where we are moving from fiction to nonfiction. Romanticism, realism, naturalism focuses on fictional works. The turn of the 20th century writing, African American literature writing, focused more on nonfiction works. So, timeline of the American Civil War, 1861 to 1865. North and South divided over the issue of slavery. Southern plantation agricultural economy depended upon slaves, while the Northern economy depended upon manufacturing. By the 1850s, abolitionism was growing in the North, and the Southern states believed the government would end slavery. The Southern states believed the government did not have the right to end slavery, however. Abraham Lincoln is elected president, winning the 1860 presidential election. His election led to 11 states seceding from the Union over the issue of slavery, forming the Confederate States of America. Confederate forces opened fire on Fort Sumter, 1861. 1862, Lincoln called on the seceded states to rejoin the Union or have their slaves declared free. 1863, he issued the Emancipation Proclamation. The South was devastated by war. The Union was preserved. The 13th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified, and the Reconstruction took place. So these are the events that represent the historical context before selections from the souls of Black folk. Results of the American Civil War, the Spanish American War, 1898, Cuba receiving independence, Spain ceded control of Guam, Puerto Rico to the U.S., Spain sold Philippines to the U.S. for $20 million. The U.S. ratified the treaty to end the Spanish American War. Hawaiian planters and businessmen sought annexation, but the president at that time rejected the request. On appeal, to consider Hawaii as vital to the U.S. economy, served as a strategic base to protect U.S. interests in Asia and to prevent other nations from taking over the islands. Hawaii instead became a U.S. territory. These events represent the historical context before the souls of Black folk. So let's not forget the differences in terms of literary movements. Romantic writing focuses on the fantastical. Realism writing focuses on an accurate imitation of life. So sometimes you can still, when you see Booker T. Washington autobiography, Up From Slavery, that is an accurate imitation of life, but it's not fiction. When you read of W.E.B. Du Bois, The Souls of Black Folk, it is a social scientist undertaking, but it's not fictional. Recap realism in terms of how it influenced the American Civil War. It reflects the human cost of the American Civil War. Naturalism rejects realism because of its limitations, because realism tends to not want to offend the sensibilities of its readers, but realists wrote about the darker aspects of human life and living. They were influenced heavily on by the scientific ideas of Charles Darwin. However, the naturalist goes into those really taboo topics like prostitution, alcoholism, domestic violence, violent deaths, crime, madness, and degeneration. And the human being is essentially an upright animal, according to Frank Norris. Naturalism focuses, sort of removes the presence of a benevolent deity, um, focuses on how nature is depicted as indifferent, nameless losers in battles against an all-powerful nature. You do see the Southerners losing their rights to slaves, right, and to slavery, but slavery is also nonfiction. It's not fictional. And then naturalism gives you a journalistic perspective with narrative distance on the character's degeneration. But in Washington and Du Bois's work, they do not give you a narrative distance. They are part of the narrative. All right, so introducing the turn of the 20th century, the rise of the immigrant. Okay. Northern and Western migration in the United States, the Northern and Western migration that followed Reconstruction, the period between 1865 and 1877, um, when the federal government set the conditions by which the states of the former Confederacy would be readmitted to full participation in the national government, caused such rapid growth in northern cities that the municipal governments were strained to the breaking point as they rushed to deliver services to millions of residents and thousands of languages. In the West, waves of migration were rapidly filling in the plains and prairies. This population boom set up a clash of cultures that continues to have repercussions in contemporary politics. In less than 20 years, the U.S. marked two total population milestones, the one in New York City exceeding 5 million persons, and the total population for the U.S. exceeding 100 million. Many immigrants to the United States in this period were fleeing from the collapse of the ancient European monarchies and empires. The dawn of the 20th century witnessed the first significant crisis of American identity since the end of the Civil War, because American identity was based upon the relationship or the imbalance of power between blacks and whites. So whites had the power; they were the slave owners, plantation owners, property owners, political power, economic power, financial power, whereas blacks were just slaves. So that was the identity. Now that you have immigrants coming on the scene at the dawn of the 20th century, the American identity is getting a change. Not only is identity getting a change, it is witnessing also the rise of African American literary culture. Whereas in the beginning, it was more whites writing literary works, and most of the writing initially derived from um, the British literary tradition. But the Civil War sort of encouraged whites to write about the war, which really created their own opportunity to be more independent from the British literary tradition. All right, so these are the works. You can find information about the 20th century. W.E.B. Du Bois's selections from the Souls of Black Folk, the Britannical entry for Plessy v. Ferguson, the Separate Car Act, Jim Crow laws, as well as the timeline, Emancipation Proclamation, and then the Britannical entry for causes and effects of the American Civil War. Again, don't forget Realism, Naturalism, Spanish American War, Glossary of Literary Terms, and then Point of View. These are W.E.B. Du Bois's resources. So we have the Britannica entry for Du Bois. He was an American sociologist and social reformer. The Hutchins Center for African and African American Research at Harvard University. And then the Harvard and the Legacy of Slavery report here. And then W.E.B. Du Bois's uh, bibliography, which you can find on the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy website. All right, so this is the end of the presentation. Thank you very much for listening.